think off the beaten track, Vít Pohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.
Welcome to Prague off the beaten track. What you can hear in the background is the charming sound of the chimes of Loreta, a magnificent Baroque pilgrimage site famous for its Carillion bells, which you just heard. Now, if you know Prague just a little bit, you may well think now, why the heck is Vít Pohanka starting an episode of a podcast called Prague off the beaten track in a touristy place like that? Because it's right opposite the Černín Palace, the seat of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's still quite touristy. But bear with me, because today we are stepping away from the crowds of Hradčany and Malá Strana to discover, I think, one of the most charming and often overlooked corners of this part of the city. It's called Nový Svět, or the New World. It's a place of really quiet streets and literally history-soaked buildings and stories waiting to be told. So our journey begins right here at Loreta Square, and I'm leaving to the kind of side streets that can be seen from the Loreta Square. So I left behind the grandiosity of Loreta, and now I enter a much quieter world. Nový Svět is a kind of slightly hidden quarter tucked under the high walls of the Černín Palace gardens, which I'm able to see through the gates, and you will be able to see them as well if you come here. And now I'm going down the Černín street, kind of downhill. It's a charming cobbled street, and already it's quite silent. So let's see where it brings us. I actually looked something up about the Capuchin monastery, which is right now on my right-hand side. It's a kind of complex of buildings again. It was founded by the brothers in the 1600s, and the Loreta Church and the Loreta Square is actually part of the monastery. It was damaged in 1757 by the Prussians when they were bombarding Prague in one of the wars. And during the World War II, the SS, the Germans, when Prague was occupied, obviously, the SS started a prison here. That's, I would say, a part of a sad story of this part of Prague. So they started a prison, then the Capuchin came back again in the 1940s after the war, but only briefly, because in the 1950s they were violently moved out. And again, the Czech counterintelligence started a prison and a kind of interrogation center here. The Capuchin brothers actually returned in the 1990s, and they've been here ever since. So that's also, I think, part of the very colorful history, sometimes sad history of this part of town. But perhaps you can hear that as well. I mean, I'm walking down the street, and I'm literally 100, maybe 150 meters from the Černínsky Palace, and already there's nobody here. I know, I mean, it's a weekday and it's January, but if you happen to be in Prague, and I've been here in summer as well, I mean, in this part of Prague, Nový Svět, it can be completely deserted because there's nobody here, and it's so close to Hradčany. It really is. At the end of Černínská Street, where it meets the Nový Svět Street, or the New World Street, which gave this quarter of Prague its name, there is a kind of little square. Unfortunately, there are quite a few cars parked here, but what you cannot miss is a little kind of cottage. It's a timbered cottage, number 10. I can see the number from here, with a shingled roof. And it's quite kind of unbelievable that even in this part of Prague, which is full of, stone houses, Baroque, etc., you see this little cottage that seems to be kind of out of place. And as I learned during my research, this is probably the only preserved timbered house in the historical core of Prague. It's known as Uraka, the crayfish, and it was named after the Brustnice stream, or rather the Brustnice stream that used to flow here quite freely, now it's underground, gave it its name because it used to be full of crayfish, raku, Uraka, and that's where the name of this house came from. It had quite a rich history. I think it's quite notable that a Czech writer in the 19th century, Jakub Arbes, fell in love with a seamstress who used to live in one of the little flats here. There they had an affair, and it's a kind of complicated story because at first he was ashamed of her. He didn't want to show in the public with her, and it seemed that he was interested in only one thing. But when she got pregnant, he actually acted honorably and married her. And another peripety was, unfortunately, that the little daughter that was born soon afterwards died. But in the end, everything turned out well, because they had a few other children, more children, and their marriage turned out to be very happy. So that's one of the stories that's connected with this house that you can see right here. Now it's a hotel, a small hotel. They actually operate a small cafe from a window where you can have some refreshments. I checked the prices, and I have to say that even though I really believe that this is off the beaten track, the prices in this small hotel that they call a romantic hotel, Uraka, the prices are definitely not off the beaten track. They correspond more closely to the other places around the Prague Castle. Anyway, I'm now heading along the Nový Svět street, which used to be the kind of main artery of this place. There's one interesting thing, I think, at least. I read that Nový Svět was actually one of the last places in Prague where the gas lights still operated in the 1980s. And you can see these lights and kind of lanterns still here, but today, of course, they are illuminated by electricity. But still, I think it's a kind of quirk detail and interesting detail that this was, even in the 1980s, they still used gas, to light the streets in this part of Prague. Feeling a little bit of a chill of winter, I decided to stop at a cozy little cafe called, surprise, surprise, Nový Svět for a cup of hot tea. And as I warm up, I think it's a perfect moment to talk a little more about some of the Czech artists, writers and filmmakers who either lived here or were somehow connected over the years with Nový Svět. I already mentioned the Czech writer Jakub Arbes in the 19th century, who found his love here. But much earlier, at the turn of the 16th and 17th century, the famous Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, who was invited to Prague by the Roman Emperor Rudolf II, stayed here in Nový Svět as well, even though he moved out of Prague after some time. And he died after a few years in Prague, quite unfortunately, but he did some very important observations here. Even though Rudolf II was mainly interested in astrology, so Tycho Brahe was writing some horoscopes and was trying, to read the future from the stars. And that's what Emperor Rudolf II was most interested in. Later on, there were other painters, filmmakers and writers and bohemians who stayed here, so that this place is even sometimes called the Prague's Montmartre. Well, I personally cannot help noting and saying, actually, because I lived in the real Montmartre in Paris in the 1990s for 3 years, that the Prague's Montmartre is really kind of minimal. It's quite smaller, and it's perhaps an exaggeration to call it a Montmartre, but maybe something of that kind of atmosphere and the spirit is here. Because in the 20th century, for example, painter, very famous Czech painter Jan Zrzavý, had his first studio here before moving away. And then there were writers in the 20th century, quite good writers and inseparable friends, Arnošt Lustig and Ota Pavel, Jewish writers. They actually bought the house Uraka, and I have to admit that I didn't know that before I kind of found out during the research. Now, Arnošt Lustig and Ota Pavel thought that they would find a kind of refuge here and probably have a good place for parties as well. But it was kind of a short-lived exercise because Lustig chose exile in 1968 after the Soviet invasion and went to live in the United States. And unfortunately, Ota Pavel struggled with mental illness and passed away in 1973. But they are very famous in Czech cultural milieu. And if you want to learn something about them, you can check the web page that is connected with Prague Off the Beaten Track on the web pages of Radio Prague International. And then you can Google them as well. And then there were some filmmakers who lived here, like Karel Kachyňa, again a famous Czech name, if you haven't heard of him, but author of some very good Czech films. And very, I would say, legendary and award-winning surrealist filmmaker and animator Jan Švankmajer and his wife Eva actually still live here in a house with a balcony that you can go past in the Černínská street. I think they are both retired. Jan Švankmajer was born in the 1930s. And he got many awards, I mean, if you check him. And his films are very interesting animated films. So, Nový Svět, which actually used to be something like a working-class suburb of the Prague Castle in the medieval times, then became nearly a part of it, but a separate part of it. And I think you can still get a sense of this Montmartre-like feeling of Nový Svět in one of the local cafes, like I'm doing just now. So I'm out again, and now I'm walking up Kapucínská Street, named after the monastery I mentioned before. I'm heading back towards Loretánské or Loreta Square, and I will make a kind of a circle. I think it shows how relatively small the area is that Nový Svět covers. Nevertheless, it's definitely worth popping in, especially if you are tired by the often quite crowded nearby Prague Castle and Malá Strana. If you are interested in exploring this place, either personally or just online, you can find some additional practical information with a map and some photos on our webpage at radio.cz. Just look for Prague Off the Beaten Track link. That's all for today, but I'm very much looking forward to taking you to the next place, which is Prokopské or the Prokop Valley, Údolí. A little bit of wilderness, but within Prague boundaries and very easily accessible by public transport. So, until then, stay healthy, stay curious a naslyšenou.
Prague Off the Beaten Track. Vít Bohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.